Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. We're delighted that you're here today to meet Christine Edstrom O'Hara, speaking about Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., father of landscape architecture. We have lots of people that are joining us today, and we're just delighted that they are coming today to this presentation that is presented in partnership with the Pasadena Garden Club. So I'll be repeating some of these things a couple of times so that everyone can hear them. But if you could please mute yourself, please put your questions in chat. Christine will answer the questions following the program. She has graciously allowed the program to be recorded, and it will be on YouTube Pasadena Library. I have enabled live transcript, but you need to enable it on your computer so that you can read what Christine is saying about the presentation. Right now you're looking at beautiful pictures online, one of course of Grand Central Park in New York City and one of Yosemite. So we have lots of people joining us. We're going to start about 5:03 to allow everyone to get here. We will be having books in our collection about Frederick Law Olmsted, and we are currently working with the Pasadena Garden Club on the selection of the appropriate books. So you need to watch our catalog, and I will be sending them out to those that have signed up for this program so that you know when they are available and you can check them out from the Pasadena Public Library. While we're waiting for everyone to join us today, this Saturday, June the 25th, Pasadena Public Library is celebrating its fourth One City, One Story Summer 2022 edition, featuring the book by Eric Nussbaum, Dodgers, Los Angeles, it's Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. Starts at 3 o'clock at the Robinson Community Room on Fair Oaks if you'd like to join us. So I want to remind everyone, if you could please mute yourself. Today's program will be recorded. Thank you very much, Christine, for allowing this. You can go to YouTube Pasadena Library, and it will be available in about a week. You can enable live transcript on your computer, and please put your questions in chat. So today's program about Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., father of landscape architecture, marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Olmsted Sr., social reformer, founder of American Landscapes, and designer of parks. The program is presented by Christine Edstrom O'Hara. She is a professor in landscape architecture at Cal Poly and San Luis Obispo, with research that focuses on landscape history and historic preservation. She holds degrees from Stanford University in English and Art History, a master's in landscape architecture and preservation planning from the University of Washington, where she moved to study with the preeminent landscape historian David Streatfeild, and a PhD in landscape architecture from the University of Edinburgh. Her dissertation analyzed the Olmsted brothers' Southern California practice and the firm's ecological approach to design in the region. She has spent the past 20 years studying the work of the Olmsted firm, and in 2002 was awarded the Garden Club of America's Douglas Dockery Thomas Fellowship in Garden History to support this research. Professor O'Hara has lectured both nationally and internationally on landscape preservation, as well as its application to sustainable landscape design and construction. She has published articles and the Journal for the Society of Architectural Historians, Landscape Journal, Pacific Horticulture, and Charles Burnham's series, Shaping the American Landscape and Shaping the Post-War Landscape. She also practices landscape architecture and historic landscape restoration. She's the former president of the California Garden and Landscape History Society and serves on the advisory council for the National Association of Olmsted Parks. The Pasadena Public Library is honored to be able presenting this program in partnership with the Pasadena Garden Club. So welcome, Christine. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christine, and the Pasadena Public Library, as well as the Pasadena Garden Club for the partnership with this presentation today. I think when we look at this first slide, most people, if they knew one landscape architecture project developed by Frederick Law Olmsted, it would be Central Park. But what you're going to see over the course of this lecture is really the broad scope of how he changed American landscape architecture and really began to envision landscapes differently, especially on a much broader scale. My apologies. So in a short biography, Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822. Just before leaving to attend Yale, he contracted sumac poisoning in his eyes, never attending college. Between 1837 and 1857, Olmsted performed a variety of jobs unrelated to landscape architecture. He was a clerk, a sailor in the China trade, a farmer, and a journalist who wrote about slavery in the American South. He moved to New York in 1848, and in 1857, to pay back debts to his father and publishing company, Olmsted became the first superintendent of a large undesigned open space in New York called Central Park for its central location in Manhattan. In 1850, Olmsted made a walking tour of Great Britain and Europe with his brother John and their mutual friend Charles Loring Brace. Charles Loring Brace had studied for the ministry and would later found the Children's Aid Society in New York, an organization which took care of impoverished and neglected children. Importantly, Olmsted would always share some of Brace's dedication to social betterment. Perhaps most importantly is what he saw when he was on the trip to England. This was a design by Joseph Paxton called Birkentend Park, in which Paxton was trying to create an idealized countryside landscape of open meadows and naturalistic woodland, all set within the city. This style would have been influenced by the landscape gardeners Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. In the park, as you can see from these slides, the park was comprised of large lawns, a lush understory planting, with the overall design appearing naturalistic. Olmsted didn't just study Birkenhead, but also Stourhead, which we see on the top. Comparing Stourhead to a later design of his at the Boston Bay Tide Marsh in Boston, Stourhead's influence was not only in its naturalism, but also the rustic stone bridge that would be incorporated into Olmsted's designs. That European trip would become integral to his future career in landscape architecture. Ultimately, the Olmsted firm would follow these values. They would connect people to nature within the city. He was definitely not anti-urbanist. Secondly, he would design regionally by responding to the natural conditions of the site. So the specificity of the site was how he would design. It was never a cookie cutter kind of a design. And then lastly, when possible, he would try to create environmental restoration through the design. I want to add one more important piece of context. Olmsted began his career in the mid-1850s during the Industrial Revolution. So while this period provided many jobs, it also created unhealthy and overcrowded working conditions for workers. Cholera and typhus were common diseases due to these living conditions, which you can see on the bottom image here. Therefore, part of the impetus for introducing nature into the city came from improving the quality of health and well-being. Prior to the development of public parks, Where did people typically go when they wanted to be in nature? That was cemeteries. For most cities, it was the only green space that they had. The design of Central Park anticipated the need for public open space, where we see the first landscape park for the public. The evolution of American park design begins with Central Park in New York City. Frederick Law Olmsted partnered with the English architect Calvert Vaux in a design competition in New York City. Vaux was trained in design, and Olmsted, as being the supervisor at the time, knew the site well. The winning design was named the Greensward Plan. And for this mostly undeveloped land in the city, the competition required that an existing reservoir be maintained. And the winning competition not only then brought the cultural elements of the site, but also it worked in relationship to the city. Land was procured from Harlem, which is on this end at 110th, all the way down to 59th Street, which is on this side. We've got Central Park West on this edge, and then Fifth Avenue are the edges. The design won because it solved two important problems. One of them was transportation, and the second was ecological with regard to water. New York City had a grid layout of streets, so the competition requirements were that the inroads to the park fit into the existing context of the city. So you'll see that the grid that we see along the edges of the park is where you enter on the roads. But once you get within the park, you'll see this curvilinear layout that is a way that it slows down the pace of people moving through it. Within the park, borrowing from Joseph Paxton's ideas from Birkentend Park, carriages and pedestrians were separated through a series of bridges that Vaux designed. In this image, we can see how the vehicles, or the vehicles being the carriages, would go across the bridge and pedestrians would go under it, allowing a safer passage. Secondly, that design solved an ecological problem. So in this aerial perspective of the completed design, we can see the creation of many lakes. At the time of the competition, the site had not been well developed because it had swampy soils. Vaux and Olmsted proposed that the site be graded to move the swampy water to lakes, making the site buildable. 95 miles of underground pipe were laid to create the drainage system. And then by the spring of 1858, more than 3,000 men were busy dredging, clearing, grading, and planting, laboriously remodeling every feature of the rugged landscape. The scale of this civil engineering was considered a masterpiece at the time. Water and drainage therefore become major parts of the design. Attached to the lakes were architectural features, such as this one here called Bethesda Terrace. And then we can also see it's right up here in this plan. In the Greensward plan, Olmsted and Vaux had called this area the Water Terrace, and they considered it the architectural heart of the park. It was placed beside a lake, and they were going to insert a grand fountain into the center. So once the Angel of Waters fountain was unveiled in 1873, the name of this location within the park was forever renamed Bethesda Terrace. And you'll notice that in this image over here, you can see it hasn't filled up with water yet. So they're under construction at that point. And here's that first image that I showed you, that view of Bethesda Terrace today, which is beautiful and much loved. Olmsted was against adding statuary into the landscape because he felt it took away from the naturalism that he was trying to create. However, he knew that civic leaders would eventually add sculpture and art pieces, so he dedicated one space for that to happen, called the Mall. And this is that space today. It's an iconic place, iconic part of that park, and you probably recognize it because it's included in so many movies. At its inception, Olmsted and Vaux considered the southern portion of Central Park as the children's district. This was because it was the first area of the park that would be reached by families traveling from the heart of the city, most of whom lived below 38th Street. At that time, one of the critical needs for children was fresh milk. Unfortunately, a series of scandals and cholera outbreaks placed the dairy production of the city under a cloud of suspicion. So to lift suspicion and fulfill the dairy needs of the people, the city provided a place where families could find a ready supply of fresh milk when traveling to the park, and thus the dairy was built. The ramble was intended as a woodland walk through a highly varied topography, basically a really wild garden, away from the carriage drives and the bridle paths, one that was to be wandered in or to be viewed as a natural landscape from the formal lakefront setting that we saw of Bethesda Terrace. In this particular picture, we can see the naturalism in these guardrails here, and also in the birdhouse designs that were rustic and made out of natural materials. The 38-acre ramble runs along the north shore of the lake and was excavated between bands of existing bedrock called Manhattan bedrock. This dense naturalistic planting and rocky outcrops provided this kind of open set of glades. Later, also an artificial stream went through it. It was naturalistic in appearance, but it was an artificially created nature. When we consider the plantings at Central Park, when it was built, there was very little existing vegetation. Over the course of construction, 25,000 trees and 250,000 shrubs were planted. Olmsted laid out the park in a series of framed views. So the long meadow in this image is framed by trees, with Olmsted paying very careful attention to the foreground, the middle ground, and the background of the design. How do you think this much amount of lawn was mowed? The answer is that Olmsted incorporated sheep to keep the lawns short, so they grazed and kept those lawns down. And then Olmsted hired a sheep herder who also kind of supported his idea of this picturesque effect while also taking care of the animals. With regard to the exterior views, the trees chosen for Central Park had a scale that would begin to screen these brownstone buildings that ran along its edges. The intention was that when visitors were in the park, they would feel in kind of an enclosed nature and away from the bustling city. Lastly, Olmsted added an educational component to the design. So the cultural and educational activities were located on the edges of the park, where today you'll find the Met, there's the Natural History Museum, and then later the Guggenheim Museum, located here by Frank Lloyd Wright. While Olmsted borrowed ideas for Central Park from England, what's truly American is the philosophical approach that parks were a place to find the psychological relief in nature. But also this was a democratic design in the sense that it had an emphasis on the needs of the poor. So while the rich residents of New York City could leave the city to the cool mountains in the summer, poor residents didn't have this option. So Olmsted and Vaux provided a solution for them in this design. Construction of Central Park came to a stop during the Civil War. And during the war, Olmsted joined the Sanitary Commission to help ensure healthy standards for the soldiers in their camps with food, water, hospitals. However, he was greatly in debt, and in 1864, during the war, was offered the position to manage the Mariposa Estates in Bear Valley, California. The estate was a group of gold mines that he would administrate and organize. He didn't plan to stay longer than 5 years, but the salary was high at $10,000 a year. Olmsted brought his family out to California, and they were amazed at the giant sequoia trees in this valley. He and his family camped in Yosemite Falls in 1864. And having visited places like Texas while a journalist, he actually had low expectations of the West and was surprised by California's beauty. Olmsted's move to California happened right before Congress deeded Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove to the state for what they called, quote, public use, resort, and recreation. This was a decision that would become the beginning of the national park system. As a nationally recognized expert on parks, Olmsted was appointed head of the Yosemite Commission and wrote the report on how to manage the land. And in this picture right here, here's a picture of Olmsted sitting in the front with a group of journalists. Olmsted advocated that no structures or roads be built, actually roads, but no structures in Yosemite. Rather, it would remain this natural park open to pedestrians and horse trails, providing what he felt was a psychic relief in this setting. In his preliminary written report to Congress in 1865, he offered one of the first expositions in the history of Western world on these three important points. One was the importance of contact with wilderness for human well-being, realizing that wilderness is not the same as designed nature like we saw in Central Park. He also wrote that the effect of beautiful scenery on human perception and the way we feel in places like this is a way that affects also our psychic health. And that lastly, it was a moral responsibility of a democratic government to preserve these regions of extraordinary natural beauty for the benefit of all the people, speaking into the ideas later of sustainability. Only in the 20th century has that preliminary report come to be widely recognized as one of the most profound and original philosophical statements that emerged from the American conservation movement. Here we see the champion of the conservation movement, Theodore Roosevelt, standing with John Muir, looking over the Yosemite Valley. On the heels of the Yosemite report, Olmsted was brought into talks about another piece of land reservation, or these bigger areas, they would call them a reservation. And this was Niagara Falls. This etching that we're looking at right now is the land prior to the 1800s. By 1869, Niagara Reservation was a mix of primitive wilderness and also ugly commercialism. Using the power of the waterway and the falls, mills had been constructed all along the banks of the river. For Olmsted, the tiny Goat Island, which we see here between the two falls that are on either side, was really the crown jewel of Niagara's scenery with its wild landscape, which we can see on the right, and really a low amount of development as seen in that engraving. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble getting my PowerPoint to go. There we go, sorry about that. When Olmsted created a design for this natural space, he minimized really the intrusions into creating basically a single path, which we can see around this edge. So single path around the edges of the island, preferring to be in this uplifting encounter with nature. For Olmsted, he saw Niagara Reservation and Niagara Falls as an ecological unit, realizing that one couldn't change one part of the reservation without affecting another part, which was an important ecological concept at the time. Due to Olmsted's proposal, the mills were removed and the natural wonder of Niagara Falls became a public park. So here's a view of Niagara Falls today. The Canadian side over here is developed, with the American side left relatively natural. Olmsted's influence and expertise continued to grow as he was asked by city after city to help with parks, environmental problem solving, and innovative ideas, including the city of Boston. So to set the context, the city of Boston was built on this peninsula next to the Boston Harbor and also the Back Bay. And typical for the time, human waste was sent to the water systems, with the Back Bay flooded by ocean tides 2 times a day that would take out that the waste by way of the Charles River. So located on this map, we also see the oldest park in the country, which was an open shared green space called Boston Commons that was built in 1634. In 1821, Roxbury Mill Dam was built, a mill designed to take advantage of the tidal waters for energy. Unfortunately, the dam cut off the tidal flow of the Atlantic Ocean, blocking those cleansing tides from washing raw sewage from the bay. You can see it being added right here and also right here. It was quoted as saying at the time that it was the foulest marsh and muddy flats to be found anywhere in Massachusetts without a single attractive feature. A body of water so foul that even clams and eels can't live there, a place that no one will go within half a mile in the summertime unless it was absolutely necessary. The way that the city decided to fix this problem was they began to fill the back bay. So this area next to Boston Common all became fill as a way to kind of reduce that bad smell, which actually still kind of continued. So meanwhile, back from California in 1878, Olmsted was hired to design a Central Park for Boston. So the Central Park that he had designed in New York City had become this national model for positive influence of public parks on city dwellers, especially in terms of social behavior, the way that people are supposed to behave when they're at a park. Designed over the course of 20 years, we see these innovations in the Boston park system. One is that he would link existing parks like this one of the Boston Commons to new parks, and that within this space, he would use and coin a new word called the parkway, this linear park here that would connect one park to another. So we can see how the connection of these green spaces from Boston Commons, Boston Back Bay Fens, Jamaica Pond, Arnold Arboretum, and then lastly to Franklin Park. What was innovative about connecting those green spaces is that Bostonians could travel for miles surrounded in greenery. And even though some of those parks might be small, everyone would be near a park. So that was different than what happened in New York, where you had to actually sometimes travel by trolley to get to Central Park. This allowed parks throughout Boston itself. Typical of all of their projects is he, as I said, connected existing parks to the new park system. So the Boston Common here, he knew that these green spaces would remain. So you'll see throughout different projects that he, even in like the Buffalo Park system, attached them to cemeteries or other kinds of green spaces to make that green space even larger. And then of course, these parkways, which were not for cars at the time, because of the fact that they have a linear form, today they're made into more of a vehicular kind of travel, but that wasn't their intention at the time. Typical also for the Olmsted firm was that when possible, a design would solve an ecological problem. So here's how Olmsted solves that issue with the back bay. So while he designed the park system and did what he was asked to do, he also fixed the sanitation problem by diverting the Muddy River into the Charles River. And then he restored those original salt marshes that had been killed by pollution. This is the newly constructed diversion from 1892. And then this is what it looked like 20 years later. So these engineering solutions were mixed with an artful design. Within the park system is Arnold Arboretum. While developing the park system, Olmsted began working with Charles Spriggs Sargent to establish and maintain an arboretum of trees and shrubs from all over the world. So this park would have been a place to learn about plants. Initially, Olmsted feared combining a park and arboretum because they're two different purposes. One is scientific, the other is this more picturesque setting, but it turned out to be a huge success. So this lilac collection that we see right here is laid out to look like a garden. One critical piece of the park system was Franklin Park. However, in order to build it, land had to be taken by the city through a planning tool called eminent domain. But Olmsted argued that the city had the right to purchase land from owners at a fair price for the good of the community as a whole. Frederick Law Olmsted designed or advocated a wide breadth of landscapes, and that you'll see in this talk tonight, including the design of university campuses. The Palo Alto Ranch, owned by Leland Stanford, the former California governor, was used to build a university dedicated to his only child, Leland Stanford Jr., who had died at age 17. Note the formal name of this school is Leland Stanford Jr. University. Leland Stanford initially wanted a university design that looked like Harvard, which architecturally was symbolical of educational design, and he hired Olmsted to design his school. But the climate and the ecology between Boston and Palo Alto are very different. Olmsted believed that design should be regionally based. That sense of place was really key, that you didn't simply take a Boston Park project and move it to the Bay Area in California. So instead, we see at Stanford a new approach to regionalism, where Olmsted looked to Mediterranean environments as a source of campus layout, the architecture, the plants, the materials. In this aerial, the view we just saw was Palm Drive, which comes from this area and into the beginning of the campus called the Oval Lawn, which is really the rare amount of lawn in this design. The church, which is located here, is the focal point to the entry campus. And then the classrooms are laid out on this axial set of this axial plan with that main quad right here. Primarily hardscape with small islands of planting, which will be important. This California design was intended to be a major demonstration of building in a semi-arid climate. So his master plan would build out the university in modules with, we can see it here, here's that quad. He would extend it on these grids to build out the university. And then these angles this way would become housing for students and faculty. Stanford is noted for its Yellowstone buildings. So that choice was intentional to match the yellow grass landscape in which it was located. So it was a way to attach it to its place. Olmsted convinced Stanford to hire the Boston firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge to design the architecture in a style that they were using on the East Coast called Romanesque. So this style included arcades and red tile roofs with a distinctly Mediterranean feel. With the landscape architecture, it would focus on using drought-tolerant plants rather than the large lawns like you would see at Harvard. There would be lots of hardscape or paving. And then in the lower image, like these Mediterranean cultures, you'll see small courtyards that are designed between the buildings. And then just like in the Boston Park system, an arboretum was established to test which plants would succeed in this part of the peninsula. So it's very important to him that the plants really be a characteristic of the place where he was designing. The final projects of Olmsted's career were designed in the early 1890s and would be the last great influence of his work. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted the Columbian World Exposition in celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. So the focus of the exposition was to demonstrate the industrial prowess of the US, and its design would greatly influence urban design. Olmsted was concerned about the ugliness of most American cities, and he desired to fix this through transforming cities to the beauty of European cities at the time. So the exposition was known as the White City, as due to budget and time constraints, all the buildings were left white in lath and plaster. Through the shared architectural style and color, there was unity in what we call architectural control. In an unprecedented collaboration of arts, architects, engineers, landscape architects, they all joined forces to create a single work in an ideal model city. And after the fair, people asked, why couldn't other cities look like this? Olmsted, along with the architect Daniel Burnham, laid out the exposition grounds. So the design focused on water, drawing its inspiration from Lake Michigan. The Court of Honor that we see shown here was a very formal layout, the design on axes with this formal statue of the Republic in a water feature called the Grand Basin, which is this water feature here. The wooded island, in contrast over here, was to be not formal lines. It was to be more naturalistic and more picturesque. And then this is the Palace of Fine Arts, which you can see here, that I'll discuss in a moment. In this painting of the Court of Honor, we can see how the buildings and other structural elements, though designed by different architects, were all the same neoclassical style in white color, which created that overall design at the exposition. Limiting materials and color also helped the design not feel overly busy, given the vast amount of statuary in these pools within the grounds. With his newest partner, Harry Codman, Olmsted redesigned Jackson Park on Lake Michigan. So rather than it be a landscape only, Olmsted and Codman conceived of this really a spectacular water park. The dredged soils that they used for this particular lake were then mounded together to create this island called Wooded Island. This lagoon and Wooded Island were central pieces of the landscape. Olmsted mounded more soil at the water's edges to better showcase the sedges, the ferns, and cattails. The lush design screened out the city and created a unique experience for fairgoers. Perhaps most important to this discussion is that the collaboration of artists and architects, that landscape architecture moved from being a craft to one of the high arts. So all along it had been a gardener kind of position, but never one of the fine arts. And that's what happened in this particular project. While most of the buildings were torn down after the exposition ended, a few were kept. So this building is still extant from the World's Fair and shows the scale of the monumental buildings. For this one in particular is at 430,000 square feet. It was originally called the Palace of Fine Arts. Then after the exposition was called the Field Columbian Museum. And then today is called the Museum of Science and Industry. And it serves as a focal point to that lagoon. Once the buildings were removed, Jackson Park was once again designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and unfortunately, Codman had died during the construction at the fair. So his new partners was his son, John Olmsted, and also Charles Elliott. Here is the Wooded Island again with the Museum of Science and Industry. Not all of Olmsted's project was, well, I should say not this lower part of this project was built by Olmsted. This was 1899. It was one of the first public golf courses that was on the west of the Allegheny Mountains. And in 1972, because of this park's immense historical value, it was listed in the National Register of Historic Parks. This is also the location for the Obama Presidential Center, and why building on this preserved Olmsted landscape has caused so much controversy. The new center, this is the Obama Center right here, will take 20 acres away from the park for its development. And you can see how monumental it is compared to back here is the nearby Museum of Science and Industry. My apologies that this computer I'm using won't forward. There we go. This is the second last project of Olmsted's career. He was working on both the Chicago World's Fair and also the Biltmore Estate at the same time. So George Washington Vanderbilt was a 26-year-old client and one of the richest people in America. Vanderbilt had hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt and Frederick Law Olmsted to design his new estate that's in Asheville, North Carolina. Building the Biltmore was at the time one of the largest undertakings in the history of American residential architecture at a mere 170,000 square feet on this house. George Vanderbilt called it his little mountain escape. The celebrated architect, Richard Morris Hunt, modeled the house on 3 chateaus that were built in 16th century France. You can see that all the elements that the house was actually 4 acres of floor space, 250 rooms, 34 bedrooms, and then we can see in the basement housed the swimming pool, gymnasium, changing rooms, bowling alley, and even much more. So it's a very large home. It also was a very large landscape with grounds that were 125,000 acres that not only did they develop acres around the gardens, parkland, but you can see the vast amount of forest land that Vanderbilt had purchased. At the Biltmore, 75 acres of formal gardens were developed, including these pleasure gardens and an arboretum and a nursery, to propagate the plants. Olmsted designed the landscape adjacent to the building with French influences, including these alleys of trees, which are here, and also these formal parterre gardens down below. This formality is really unusual for Olmsted because He usually had this much more naturalistic layout, but his intention was to make it in keeping with the architecture of the building. As we move down to the edges of the park, so that last space was right up here, now we're down below the wall, we begin to transition from that formal to the picturesque in this particular image. Most importantly, however, the grounds of the 125,000 acre estate included, as I said, not only those developed acres and gardens, but the intention for this design on Olmsted's behalf was to begin to protect the environment and reclaim the over-farmed land. So Olmsted established at this particular house, the first managed forest. In the project, Olmsted reconsidered the outer landscape in a new way that had never really been seen in terms of other landscape designers at the time. And Vanderbilt obviously had the means to carry out Olmsted's plans. So rather than developing the whole site as Vanderbilt initially wanted, Olmsted convinced him it'd be better to have a large garden close to the house with views onto thousands of acres, remaining a grand forest. Olmsted ensured that long-term success by persuading Vanderbilt to hire the first trained forester named Gifford Pinchot in 1892. Pinchot implemented a unique management system that included identifying the tree species, what were their growth patterns, how many volumes of acre could they have through selective thinning. The plan was intended to improve the forest while also turning a profit on for the landowner, which is the first of its kind in America, and it served as a national model. Pinchot eventually left the estate for Washington, D.C. to head the Division of Forestry, and later became the first U.S. Forest Service head. Ultimately, the Biltmore lands became the basis for Pisgah National Forest. Pinchot's work exemplified the sound land management practices by fixing the soil with the plantings. And it was also here that Olmsted found this marriage of science and art, the picturesque theory blending with really the most advanced ecological understanding of its time. By 1896, at the age of 74, Olmsted began to experience the symptoms of dementia. So doctors diagnosed him with premature old age brought on by overwork and complicated by melancholia or depression. His family brought him to McLean Hospital, which was one of the first hospitals to treat mental health disorders. And ironically, Olmsted had made recommendations for its design. He died there on August 27th, 1903. In one of his last letters, Olmsted writes to his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and directs him to complete the Biltmore Arboretum. The work by Frederick Law Olmsted continued for another 60 years through his children, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and John Charles Olmsted, and their firm, the Olmsted Brothers. And his legacy can be seen today in nearly every state. So that's the final slide.
Thank you very much, Christine, for an absolutely fabulous and informative program. So educational. Your photos were absolutely beautiful. You took us on a journey all across the country. Definitely Frederick's very, very important life to the United States. If anyone has any questions, please put them in chat. While we're waiting for people to put their questions in chat, I want to remind you that the state of California and the California Public Libraries are involved with a new project called California State Park Pass. You can check out a free state park vehicle day use pass at your local Pasadena Public Library. Pasadenas are available to all library card users. If you don't have a library card, visit your local branch to get one. The library card and the park pass are free. And the concept is that we hope people get out and visit their public parks. These are California state parks, not federal parks. So come to your library and check that out. I think we have some questions
Christine,
in chat.
can I add
now.
one thing to what you just said? That the person responsible for creating the first 125 state parks that were purchased was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who was hired by California to locate parks all of California for every landscape type. And that all the parks would be within 1 day's drive of a California resident.
Fabulous. Well, that encourages everyone to come and check out your vehicle park pass. So everyone is thanking you very, very much for this wonderful presentation, Christine.
Thank you.
Somebody wants to know whether Frederick Law Olmsted designed Pasadena Library. And no, he did not. It's a Myron Hunt and an H.C. Chambers architectural building. There was an architectural contest and they won the right to build it. I think there's probably a lot of other famous architects in Pasadena as far as landscape architects, what I should say as well. We know that they're famous architects.
And it also is confusing because Frederick Olmsted Jr. dropped junior in the early 1900s. So people get confused on which one is the senior that designed and which one is the junior that designed. So senior wouldn't have any projects after 1896.
Thank you. So let's see, here's another question. What is your favorite park to visit? Do you have a favorite park?
I have a lot of favorite parks, but I think of the Olmsted one, Central Park is one of my most favorite. It's just incredibly thoughtful in terms of all the different things that you can do. You don't have that sense of naturalness as much as you would have at the time because of these skyscrapers that wrap the park today. But that one is definitely one of my favorites. They also have really great park systems. And I think you're looking at the Boston Park system with its parkways, that I think also incredibly beautiful, the way they all work together, the way that each one is unique, each of those parks are unique. But then I would also add that places like Yosemite are an extension of a different type of park. And so Olmsted would have been very broad, and actually the whole Olmsted firm was very broad in terms of how they defined a park. It wasn't just a small neighborhood place, but really a numerous ones from those small ones to a watershed scale design.
Thank you very much. Everyone is saying how fabulous your presentation was, and we thank you very much. When did Olmsted Point in Yosemite get named?
That's a good question. I don't really know. So it's a good question of who named it when. I mean, Olmsted would have been there 1860s, did not stay very long. You know, he was more writing about its management. His children did stay involved in the development of Yosemite. So see the Olmsted brothers come back and help with placing parking in some of these orchards that were in the valley floor. But that's a good question. I should know this because it is obvious. I'm not sure if it's after junior or senior, probably senior.
Thank you. So tell us more about his work as a journalist.
So this would have been obviously before his design of Central Park. But what he did is he traveled through the American South, writing pieces for New York newspapers about slavery and what the South was like. There was this kind of, people really wanted to know, this was before the Civil War, really wanted to know what the South was like. So you can read his writings are collected in many, many different books. He was very thoughtful about keeping track of all these ideas, but you can read about his ideas. Obviously, he's against slavery as a northerner traveling in the South, but it will give you a good cultural understanding of what that time period was like from what he saw. He'll write about, his walking through England, and he'll talk about the villages and the people and the culture, and they're really a nice time period to better understand from his perspective what he was seeing in the landscape and the culture while he was there.
Well, it gave him a lot of future view for what he developed throughout.
Absolutely.
the country.
Absolutely.
So are there any other questions in chat? Anybody else? I think you've just covered so much, Christine. It leaves us without any questions, but remember, we are working the Pasadena Library with the Pasadena Garden Club on books that will be in our collection, and Christine has suggested some as well. And we will be ordering them and putting them into our collection that you can do further research as well.
There is a really beautiful series out by Charles Beveridge, who's probably one of the most important Olmsted senior historians, where they have books that are just on their parks, and they're beautiful coffee table books. You can see the plans, you can see the drawings. He has ones of, I think if they're residential community. So there's all these new books that just came out from John Hopkins Press that not only do we have books of compilations of Olmsted's writing, but also these really large picture books that people want to see across the country, all these different projects, to look at them in terms of, they may in plan view look similar, but will look very different when you see them in context within those communities.
So you've studied him so much. Do you think he really had ultimate end of his life a favorite park or favorite landscape or something that he enjoyed the most or wanted to revisit?
You know, I don't know if he had a favorite of his own, but going to England was one of his favorite places to travel. And so you can see from Humphrey Repton is a landscape gardener, early 1800s, who adopted some of Capability Brown's designs of these kind of rolling hills, the groves of trees, but Repton had more understory and better connected the building and landscape together. So for Olmsted Senior, when he's traveling in places like that, that's really his happy place. And you can see when he comes back to the United States, even at places like Stanford, there's a lushness when the plants come together, because he likes that lush landscape, even though with the lack of water, you're going to see plant changes and things like that. And that'll be true of the Olmsted brothers too. If you go to places like Palos Verdes that they designed, you can see how lush that planting was. That kind of picks up a little bit on that British landscape, that English landscape that the father had loved and the children adopt to.
Right, because someone has just asked so that you could talk a little bit about the development of Palos Verdes.
So that I could talk about all day. So
Oh.
this one, the Olmsted firm were invited to this project because Frank Vanderlip had a home in New York that the Olmsted brothers designed. And so when he goes to California to buy the land for Palos Verdes as more of an investment, he hires the Olmsted brothers to lay out the community. And they start it in kind of the beginning of World War I, 1914. And with the lack of development during that period, they have a lot of time to do initial research in terms of winds and topography and propagate plants. It propagates like 10,000 of one tree and begin to plant these lots. The Olmsted brothers open an office. They've got enough Western work between Seattle, Portland, California, that they open an office in Redondo Beach in 1922. And then in 1923, as part of a contractual agreement with Vanderlip, it's required that Olmsted Jr. and one of the principals from the firm named Fred Dawson are required to live at Palos Verdes while it's under construction. So we see them becoming residents of California, which makes a big difference in terms of them understanding this region so well when they live part of the year here and part of the year, in Boston, where the other office was. But they ended up spending 20 years on that project, one that they didn't think they'd be on it for very long. They thought John Charles was still alive then, and he had a civil engineering background, so he was laying out a lot of the roads. And then after he passed, Olmsted Jr. kept on that project until up into the 30s. In the Depression, when construction basically stopped.
Fabulous. Probably a lot of us in California don't realize or connect that with Palos Verdes, the Olmsted family.
And he also did work at Pacific Palisades. So they worked on that project. They designed Leimert Park. They consulted or designed the Olmsted brothers, more so than the dad, but the dad did Mountain View Cemetery. That's in the East Bay. He also did Stanford. And then Yosemite are really his three major projects that get built. But the Olmsted brothers designed or consulted on over 200 projects in California. So it's one of the fifth largest number of projects in the United States by the firm. So it's got a really rich history. They've got work in Monterey, all the way up the coast. And they said the state park system was also Olmsted Jr.
Thank you very much. Now someone has asked a question. It's about what happened to the people who live on what became Central Park in Yosemite. Were they compensated as the Franklin Park residents were?
They were taken off their land. Seneca Village was along one of the western edges. So there was an immigrant community and a Black community that lived there. And they had kind of moved to that section of New York to move away from racism. They could establish farms there. Their land was taken by eminent domain. And I think they always questioned, why moving. It was that one chunk. It wasn't Olmsted that was moving. It was the park board that made that decision. In the valley in Yosemite, there were farmers that were down there that thought they established their farms, those orchards and things that were there, they'd be able to keep their land. But I'm not sure if it was eminent domain or they just simply moved them off because now they were on federal land doing that work. So we do see people get moved. It's always a question for me, when I teach about, say, the design of Paris, what Paris looks like today was incredibly damaging to the communities that lived there at the time, raising their houses, taking out their streets. Does that begin to equalize the value of that community later? And I think that's a decision that we, as urban designers and designers, we always have to think about if there's a fairness to that or justification for it.
So there is more information on Olmsted at Olmsted 200 website for those of you that want to do further study. And we can't thank Christine enough for her time and efforts for the Pasadena Public Library and the partnership with the Pasadena Garden Club today. So thank you so much, Christine, for this absolutely fabulous presentation. I know everybody agrees with me. It was absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for all your time and your knowledge. And so everyone have a wonderful evening. Please go to Olmsted's website. Please look for the books at the Pasadena Public Library for your further research. Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Good night.